Hello, I'm Jasmine Batten, Wildlife Disease Coordinator for the Missouri Department of Conservation. The following presentation on chronic wasting disease is being given at a series of public meetings throughout the state in October. This presentation is being shared online so that folks that cannot make our public meetings have an opportunity to view the material. First, I'll cover exactly what chronic wasting disease is, including why we are so concerned about it and where it has been found. I will explain the Department of Conservation's approach to managing and slowing the spread of this disease, including outlining a few potential regulation changes that we are considering making. Finally, I'll tell you what you can do to help if you're concerned and explain how you can provide your input on potential regulation changes. So moving on to what the disease is. Chronic wasting disease, or CWD, belongs to a larger family of diseases called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. These diseases are also called TSEs or prion diseases. There are a number of TSEs or prion diseases that can be found across a variety of mammal species. Each known TSE is specific to the species that it infects. Some of these you might have heard of. In sheep, there is scrapie. In cattle or cows, there is BSE or mad cow disease, and in humans, there are a number of known TSEs. Although they are all very rare, the most common known TSE in humans is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD. TSEs are grouped into one family of diseases because they share a number of common characteristics. One of the most notable things about TSEs are that they are all 100% fatal. At this point in time, there is no known cure for any TSE disease. Additionally, they all have a characteristic long incubation period, meaning from the time of exposure until the time an animal or person shows symptoms of a TSE is a very long time, from months to even years or decades. All TSEs cause neurological damage and therefore manifest with some sort of neurological symptoms, and uniquely, they are all believed to be caused by a unique infectious agent called a prion protein. While all mammals have normal prion proteins, in TSEs, these proteins become misfolded. The TSE that is known to affect members of the deer family is chronic wasting disease, or CWD. Note, CWD at this point in time is not known to naturally infect any species outside of the deer family. There is no known vaccine, treatment, or cure for this disease, and there is no true genetic immunity to chronic wasting disease. Although some deer vary in the length of time it takes to get sick and die from chronic wasting disease, every deer that is exposed to the disease is susceptible to coming down with it. The neurological damage that CWD creates manifests as declining body condition in the deer or elk once they become sick with the disease. Although there is not one single characteristic symptom of chronic wasting disease, a deer or elk that's showing symptoms of the disease typically will have a decline in general body condition, including extreme weight loss, coupled with some sort of neurological symptom, such as abnormal behavior or abnormal posture. Generally, once sick with the disease, these animals decline very quickly and they don't look well. If I was to ask you which deer has chronic wasting disease, my guess is many of you would point to the deer on the left. This animal is obviously not well, but surprisingly, the healthy-looking buck on the right, which was harvested by a hunter, tested positive for chronic wasting disease. It's important to note that on average, it takes a minimum of 18 months from the time a deer or elk is exposed to chronic wasting disease until symptoms show up. The really bad news about that is that a seemingly healthy and normal acting deer can move around the landscape spreading the disease long before it looks sick. So can you just look at a deer and know that it has CWD? Unfortunately, as we already talked about, many of these symptoms are not unique to chronic wasting disease, so it is really not possible to diagnose a deer with a disease through a visual assessment alone. Although there are tests that are done sometimes on live animals, especially in a research setting or in captive animals, it's important to note that a live animal test is extremely invasive and can only be conducted through surgical procedure. Additionally, The tests for CWD that are done on live animals are less sensitive than tests that are conducted on dead animals, meaning that the live animal version of CWD tests is more likely to have a false negative result. For these reasons, the gold standard for chronic wasting disease is to test a particular set of lymph nodes in the neck of the deer after the animal has died. Deer that are infected with CWD shed the agent in urine, feces, saliva, and even antler velvet. Through this shedding, CWD can spread directly from a sick deer to an uninfected deer through close contact. The CWD prions that are shed from sick animals are extremely robust once they get out into the environment. In fact, they can resist temperatures up to 1100 degrees or greater. They resist freezing and thawing, and they do not degrade with exposure to common disinfectants. CWD prions remain infectious in the environment for years. For this reason, CWD can spread indirectly in the environment when uninfected deer come into contact with soil, water, or plants contaminated with CWD prions. It's likely that the importance of this environmental spread increases as the number of infected animals increases in a population. Sites where deer congregate or are attracted to, including places where minerals are placed or supplemental feed is used, can potentially act as CWD hotspots in the environment. Infected carcasses can also spread the disease as they degrade in the environment. Those prions stay infectious long after the carcass is gone. Now that you know a little bit about what CWD is, let's talk about where CWD has been found. The disease was first described in a captive research facility in Colorado in 1967. By the 1980s, the disease had been found in free-ranging deer and elk in parts of Colorado and Wyoming. So if you look at the known distribution of CWD across the 1990s, it's easy to understand why wildlife managers in the Midwestern and eastern parts of the state or the country thought that CWD really was a Western problem. However, if you fast forward to 2018, you will see that CWD in both free-ranging and captive animals has spread dramatically across North America. CWD has even been found in locations as far away as Norway and South Korea. While the disease naturally does spread through a population slowly over time, it's very likely that humans have played a big role in transporting this disease at a faster rate than would have naturally occurred. The disease can be spread through the movement of live infected deer or dead infected deer. In Missouri, MDC started testing for chronic wasting disease back in 2001. Before the first detection of the disease occurred in 2010, over 28,000 free-ranging deer had been tested and CWD had not been found. This early surveillance suggested that CWD was not something widely established in the state and was really a new problem. The first detections in Missouri occurred in 2010 and 2011 in captive big game hunting preserves in Macon and Linn County. In response, the Missouri Department of Conservation intensified surveillance of free-ranging wild deer within closer proximity to those infected facilities. In 2012, 5 CWD-positive wild white-tailed deer were confirmed within 1 to 2 miles of the positive big game hunting preserve in Macon County. In response to the detection of CWD in Missouri's free-ranging deer herd, MDC drafted and implemented a CWD surveillance and management plan. This plan called for continued routine surveillance throughout the entire state in order to detect any new areas of CWD infection as early as possible. In addition, the plan established a CWD management zone. This management zone included counties within 25 miles of CWD detections. Sampling was intensified in these management zone counties in order to better monitor the prevalence and distribution of the disease. And you will see on this map, highlighted in tan, the CWD management zone as it existed in 2012. Since 2012, CWD has been detected in Missouri in 10 additional counties. You'll see the up-to-date known distribution of chronic wasting disease in Missouri on the map is indicated by blue dots. In 2016, the state of Arkansas detected chronic wasting disease in the northwest part of their state. You'll see the red dots below the state of Missouri. Those are the known cases of CWD in Arkansas to date. It's clear that the disease has been on their landscape for some time, although it went undetected for years. To date, they've had nearly 370 cases of the disease, and it covers a large number of counties. The single red dot to the north of Missouri shows one case of chronic wasting disease that was detected in southern Iowa last fall. Although Iowa has a number of CWD cases in the northeast part of their state, this is their first detection in southern Iowa. Because of the detections of CWD in 11 total counties in Missouri and by our neighbors to the north and south, the CWD management zone has expanded to include 48 counties. Despite the detection of chronic wasting disease in 11 counties widely spread across Missouri, it's important to keep in perspective that chronic wasting disease appears to still be a relatively rare disease in the state. Since 2012, Missouri has only detected 75 total CWD positive wild deer. What this tells us is that where the disease is found, it has been relatively recently introduced, as indicated by the limited geographic distribution and the relatively low prevalence. It also shows us that MDC's surveillance efforts to date are succeeding in finding the disease relatively early. So now you know what CWD is and where it has been found. Let's talk about why we're so concerned about chronic wasting disease. From the simplest perspective, we care so much about chronic wasting disease because deer are important. From an ecosystem perspective, deer play a significant role in influencing the plant and animal composition across the landscape. In Missouri, we are fortunate that deer are widely abundant. Current population estimates exceed 1.2 million deer. This is quite the conservation success story. It's hard to imagine that back in 1925, there were an estimated 400 deer in Missouri. Deer are important to the nearly 500,000 deer hunters that call Missouri home. 1 in 12 Missouri residents hunt deer, and for many of these families, venison is an important and healthy lean source of protein. Hunting has an incredible influence on the state's economy. It's estimated that hunting contributes a $1 billion impact economically each year. Finally, Missouri has nearly 2 million wildlife watchers in the state, many who are passionate about deer. We are concerned about chronic wasting disease in Missouri because states where the disease has existed for much longer, even decades, have demonstrated that CWD has the potential to become very widespread and prevalent over time. For example, if you look at the state of Wyoming, where CWD was detected in free-ranging animals in the early 1980s, you'll see that the known distribution of CWD, indicated in purple on this map, covers the vast majority of the state. If you look at the state of Wisconsin, which detected the disease in the early 2000s, you'll find local areas of the state where prevalence in adult male deer exceeds 55% and prevalence in adult females is as high as 35%. Looking at states like Colorado and Wyoming, we see no evidence that CWD will stabilize over time or burn itself out. This is concerning because once the disease is widely established, the known management tools are limited. With the concern of environmental contamination building over time, it very well is likely possible to eliminate the disease completely once widely established. For this reason, Missouri strongly believes that finding the disease early and preventing its spread into new areas gives us the best shot at learning to successfully live with this disease and minimize negative impacts to our deer herd over time. It likely takes many years, if not decades, for CWD to become widely spread and to reach high prevalences. And I know some of you are thinking, What about Colorado and Wyoming? Certainly they still have a lot of deer and elk on their landscape. Well, recent field studies have documented significant impacts from chronic wasting disease on deer and elk populations. I'm just going to give you a few examples of this research here. Some of the most compelling research on this topic has come from southeast Wyoming, where researchers a few years ago reported the results of a deer survival study. In this region of their state, researchers found that one mule deer herd is experiencing a 19% population reduction each year directly as a result of the high CWD prevalence in their area. Essentially, once CWD prevalence becomes high enough, survival decreases, outpacing population growth. Researchers estimate that without any changes to current harvest pressure, this mule deer population could become extinct within 41 years. This research was essentially replicated in white-tailed deer, and the researchers found that white-tailed deer in southeast Wyoming in this particular herd are experiencing a population decline of 10% each year as a direct result of CWD in the population. The state of Wisconsin has recently initiated a deer survival project to try to understand what population impacts, if any, chronic wasting disease is having to their state. This graph from the Wisconsin DNR's website shows survival rates of CWD positive deer indicated with the red line as compared to survival of deer that do not have CWD indicated in the blue line. Strikingly, researchers have found in the first year that the deer that were infected with chronic wasting disease were 3 times as likely to die from all causes of mortality, including hunting, roadkill, and directly from chronic wasting disease. This is concerning. If enough deer are infected with CWD in the population and their survival decreases enough, then certainly population growth can't keep pace with mortality. We'll have to follow the results of this study over the next couple years to see what the final conclusions are, but it wouldn't be surprising if areas of southwest Wisconsin are experiencing population declines in their white-tailed deer because of chronic wasting. Another reason to care about chronic wasting disease is because we don't know yet whether there are any related human health concerns. It is important to note that to date there have been no known cases of CWD in humans. And we certainly know that there are likely thousands of deer and elk infected with chronic wasting disease that are consumed by hunters each year. But there are a lot of unknowns about CWD, and research is certainly ongoing. We do know that a similar prion disease in cows, mad cow disease, was able to cross the species barrier when humans ate meat from infected cattle. Additionally, the known human prion diseases that have been identified often have very long incubation periods. So it's possible that if CWD has crossed the species barrier, it will take decades before that occurrence is noted in the population. One way that researchers are trying to understand whether or not chronic wasting disease could potentially infect humans is by using macaque monkeys. Macaque monkeys are a primate species that are commonly used as a model for human diseases. Last summer, some attention was raised when researchers preliminarily released some results suggesting that macaque monkeys could get chronic wasting disease after being fed muscle tissue from infected deer and elk. Confusingly for the public, a completely separate study using different methods more recently released final results that showed in their study macaque monkeys did not get chronic wasting disease. Although these studies do not necessarily cancel each other out, what they do is highlight the unknowns with this issue. We'll have to wait for more research to be done until we can really get a better handle on whether there are potential risks of chronic wasting disease to humans. Despite the fact that there have been no known cases of chronic wasting disease infection in humans, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention do recommend that hunters take a few common sense precautions. First, if you're hunting in an area that is known to have chronic wasting disease, they strongly suggest that you consider having your deer tested before eating it. If deer test positive for chronic wasting disease, they suggest that you do not consume the meat from that animal. And generally, they recommend that hunters do not consume deer that look sick or act oddly. Finally, when dressing your deer or processing your meat, it's recommended that you wear gloves and that you minimize handling the brain and spinal cord tissues. These are the parts of the deer where the CWD prion can be found in the greatest concentration. Now that we know more about CWD and where it has been found, I'm going to move on to discuss how MDC is addressing this disease threat. First, we are aiming to find the disease where it exists on the landscape. Our routine, ongoing, statewide surveillance aims to detect the disease as early as possible in new areas. Again, we believe that early detection of the disease before it is widely established and environmental contamination is high gives us the best chance of minimizing the impacts of this disease over time. Historically, we've worked with taxidermists in half of the state each year who collect samples on our behalf. It's important to note that taxidermists are excellent partners because they primarily sample adult male deer, the sex and age class most likely to have chronic wasting disease. New for fall of 2018, we're expanding the number of taxidermists that we're working with and recruiting meat processors. Additionally, we're expanding this routine statewide surveillance, at least on a trial basis, to cover the entire state annually rather than half of the state. What you see in this map is the locations of the participating meat processors and taxidermists who are collecting samples on behalf of MDC for the 2018 season. Once we find CWD, we work to monitor it. This means that we increase dramatically the number of deer that are sampled in and around where CWD has been found in an effort to understand where the disease is located, how many deer are infected, and how these patterns are changing over time. One of the most powerful tools to increase sampling size in our CWD management zone has been the implementation of mandatory sampling. Mandatory sampling is a regulation that requires hunters in priority CWD management zone counties to bring their deer in for testing if they're harvested in these counties on opening weekend of firearms season. This effort allows for an enormous increase in sample size over a very short period of time. Last year, opening weekend, MDC staff collected 16,000 deer in just 2 days. What you'll see on this map is the 2018 mandatory sampling counties highlighted in tan, and the location of the mandatory sampling stations. Finally, MDC is actively trying to manage or treat chronic wasting disease in the state. These efforts aim to limit the spread of the disease into new areas of the state and to slow how fast the number of infected deer is growing. One way that we accomplish this goal is by implementing regulation changes within our chronic wasting disease management zone counties. The first regulation is a prohibition on the use of supplemental feed or minerals intended for deer. This regulation is important because those practices congregate deer unnaturally and increase contact rates, both practices that facilitate CWD spread at a greater rate. Second, we slightly increase the number of antlerless deer permits that are available to hunters in these counties. This increase in antlerless harvest aims not to dramatically decrease populations in these counties, but rather to keep them stable and avoid undesirable population growth. Finally, in these counties, we remove the antler point restriction. The APR essentially protects all young male deer. We know that yearling deer are most likely to disperse the greatest distances, meaning that they have the greatest risk for spreading chronic wasting disease into new areas on the landscape. While we're not telling hunters that they must harvest these young animals, we do not believe that it is responsible disease management to protect them. In very localized areas where chronic wasting disease is confirmed, we're talking about an area usually within 1 to 2 miles of CWD detections, we work closely with hunters and landowners to increase harvest greatly in these localized areas where the disease occurs. The first way we do this is by offering landowners in designated CWD core areas, again areas within 1 to 2 miles of detections, the opportunity to harvest an increased number of deer during the normal hunting seasons between September 15th and January 15th. Each winter after hunting seasons close on January 15th, MDC works closely with participating landowners in designated CWD core areas to implement post-season targeted culling as a tool to increase harvest of deer in these CWD impacted areas. Between January 16th and March 15th, either landowners that have received authorization from MDC or trained MDC staff with permission from landowners work to harvest deer within the boundaries of CWD core areas. Note, participation in this program is entirely voluntary. All deer are tested, and deer that are tested negative for chronic wasting disease either go back to the landowner or are donated to share the harvest. Increasing the number of deer that are removed in these areas that have CWD increases the chances that infected or exposed deer are removed from the population at a greater rate. By limiting the number of infected deer in the population, we have an opportunity to potentially slow prevalence growth over time or even possibly stabilize it. By keeping the number of infected deer locally in the population limited, we are aiming to minimize the amount of CWD environmental contamination. And finally, while people in the CWD core area most definitely are going to see a decreased density in their local deer herds, it's important to note that these population impacts only occur on a local level, and targeted culling actions are not limiting deer densities at a greater county scale or beyond. Last winter, just over 1,400 deer were removed during postseason targeted culling efforts, and these deer were spread throughout 8 different locations in the state. To put this into perspective, during normal hunting seasons last year, hunters removed over 285,000 deer from the state of Missouri. So in reality, the number of deer that are removed during targeted culling are a very small proportion of Missouri's overall deer population. Importantly, last year during targeted culling efforts, 16 CWD positive deer were removed from the population. These deer would have remained in their local area, spreading the disease, had targeted culling not removed them. To date, of the over 101,000 deer that MDC has tested for chronic wasting disease, just 6% of these animals have come from postseason targeted culling efforts. However, strikingly, about 50% of our CWD positive animals have been deer removed during culling efforts. MDC is committed to the continued utilization of targeted culling as a CWD management tool because there is evidence that it works. This graph is from a research study published out of the state of Illinois. Both Illinois and their neighbors to the north, Wisconsin, detected chronic wasting disease in the early 2000s. In initial response, both states implemented targeted culling as a management tool. However, in 2007, the state of Wisconsin ceased targeted culling actions, and you'll see that their CWD prevalence started to rise dramatically at that point in time. In contrast, the state of Illinois has continued and sustained targeted culling actions since the early 2000s, and their overall CWD prevalence has remained relatively stable. However, it is important to note that the state of Illinois continues to see the disease show up in new areas. So is targeted culling working in Missouri? This is a hard question to answer. CWD really is a slow spreading disease, and it's going to have to be monitored for a long time into the future. But if we look at our original CWD core area in Macon County, approximately 55 square miles, we'll see that the prevalence of CWD within that core area has remained relatively stable since the first detection in 2011. So there is some early indication that targeted culling in that core area is at least preventing undesired prevalence growth rate. Similarly, in the a DARE core area, the place where we've been working for the second greatest length of time, you will see that when we first found the disease within the 33 square mile area, CWD prevalence was just under 3%. Last year, after targeted culling efforts, CWD prevalence was below 1%. So again, this isn't definitive proof that targeted culling is working, but it does give us a glimmer of hope that CWD prevalence is being limited or stabilized in those regions. So if you're concerned about chronic wasting disease, what can you do to help? First, you can participate in CWD sampling opportunities. There are a number of ways that you can have your deer tested outside of mandatory sampling efforts. Check out the MDC website or call your local MDC office to find out more. I would greatly recommend that you do not feed deer or place minerals. Again, these are practices that are known to help facilitate disease spread, and if you're in the CWD management zone, these are actions that are actually prohibited. We do appreciate the public monitoring their deer herd, and if you see deer that are exhibiting symptoms of chronic wasting disease, please report those to your local conservation agent or regional MDC office. While we typically aren't able to sample every single sick deer on the landscape, we do make a concerted effort to sample those deer that seem to potentially have CWD as much as we are able to. Finally, as a hunter, it's really important that you properly dispose of your deer carcasses. You have a few options. First, you can dispose of parts in a landfill. Second, you could bury on site where the deer was harvested. Note, burying a carcass from a CWD infected deer does not entirely eliminate the risks of spread, but it might reduce it by containing those carcass parts to a small area. Finally, as a last resort, you could leave the carcass parts on the landscape at the location of harvest. The most important message here is to understand that a deer that's infected with CWD, the carcass can spread the disease. So don't take a carcass, travel any distance with it, and leave it lay in a new location. As I've outlined so far, MDC has taken a number of actions to date to minimize the spread of CWD across the state. However, we continue to reevaluate our efforts and identify additional areas of risk that go unmet. Now I'm going to tell you about a few potential regulation changes that we are considering to address disease spread risks that have not yet been addressed or have not been addressed adequately. The first risk we're going to discuss is the risk of CWD spread through the movement of infected deer carcasses. We consider this a high risk for disease spread. Controlled studies have definitively shown that an infected carcass can indeed spread CWD to uninfected deer. We know that a large number of hunters hunt on properties that are located a distance away from where they actually live. In the map on the left, you will see St. Clair, a CWD positive county, highlighted in red. The blue counties show the locations where hunters who harvested deer in St. Clair County reside. The map on the right shows Adair County, another CWD positive county, in red, and in blue, the counties for which the hunters that harvested deer in Adair actually live. Currently, we have no regulations limiting the movement of deer carcasses from areas in Missouri known to have CWD to areas where the disease has not been detected. We are considering moving forward a regulation that would prohibit the movement of whole deer carcasses out of high-risk CWD areas. This regulation would allow the movement of lower-risk parts, including finished taxidermy products and skulls and antlers that have been cleaned, as well as processed and packaged meat, meat that has been boned out, or deer that have been quartered with the spine and the head removed. The intent of this regulation would be to minimize the highest risk parts, including the spinal tissue and the brain, from moving out of areas that likely have CWD. If this carcass movement regulation goes forward, We are considering allowing an exemption that would allow hunters with whole carcasses to move out of CWD high-risk areas if they bring those deer directly to a licensed meat processor or taxidermist. However, note, if we include this provision, we will be working closely with our protection division to be sure that the regulation is written in such a way that it can be enforceable. We recently asked hunters, how do you dispose of your deer carcasses? And it seems likely that a low number of hunters would be impacted by this regulation. The hunters most likely impacted included those that reported that they take their deer out of the county and dispose on their own property, potentially the 8% that said they disposed of deer in a trash or a landfill, and potentially 5% that said they disposed by another method. By and large, 85% of our hunters would likely be uninfected by a carcass movement regulation. We are seeking comments from the public on this potential regulation change. You can provide your comments on the MDC website. More details to come at the end of this presentation. The movement of infected carcasses from outside of our state borders into Missouri is another potential risk for CWD spread. We already have a regulation that prohibits the transport of whole deer and elk carcasses into the state of Missouri, and we do allow for the exception to bring in the lower risk parts. There is an exemption, however, and you are allowed to transport a deer or elk carcass into Missouri whole if you report that import to an MDC hotline within 24 hours and you take the carcass to a licensed meat processor. This graph shows the number of deer and elk carcasses being reported as imported into the state of Missouri over time. Although it looks like that number is decreasing, we have no reason to believe that hunters are actually bringing fewer numbers of carcasses into the state. Rather, we think this is a reflection of poor compliance with the reporting requirement. This reporting line has given us valuable information though. If we look at the total carcasses reported as being imported to Missouri to date, and we focus on the states that have had greater than 50 carcasses imported, we'll see that the greatest number of imported carcasses comes from the state of Arkansas. This is concerning as we know that there is a high prevalence of a CWD in Northwest Arkansas. Of the remaining states that have had 50 or more carcasses reported entering into Missouri, you'll see all of them except one has found CWD in their own wild. This regulation exemption is difficult to enforce or track and is confusing to hunters. We know that we have whole carcasses coming into Missouri from areas in the country that have high CWD prevalence, so this is clearly a risk for CWD introduction into new areas. We are considering eliminating this exception so that no whole deer or elk carcasses would be allowed into the state of Missouri from hunter-harvested deer. We are asking you to share your opinion on this potential regulation change. As previously discussed, we already have a regulation in place that prohibits feeding deer or using minerals within CWD management zones. There is strong support and evidence for this regulation. First, it's been demonstrated that CWD definitely spreads indirectly in the environment. Further, research has found that CWD prions actually bind to some soil types and become more infectious. Most recently, researchers out of Wisconsin confirmed that mineral sites do indeed act as CWD reservoirs for disease spread. The current feeding and mineral prohibition does allow a few exemptions. For instance, food plots are allowed, the use of minerals for regular agricultural settings are allowed, and feed that excludes access by deer is allowed. However, there is an exemption that allows you to place feed within 100 feet of a residence or occupied building. The original intent of this regulation was to minimize the impact of the feeding prohibition on wildlife watchers. However, We do know that people within this 100 feet of their residence are continuing to actively feed deer, and we do know that is a significant disease risk. So what we're considering is removing that exemption so that deer cannot be fed in a CWD management zone within 100 feet of a residence or occupied building. Again, please give us your input on this potential regulation change. In summary, there is real compelling evidence that chronic wasting disease poses a serious threat to the long-term sustainability of Missouri's deer population. Here at MDC, we will continue to base our management actions and decisions on the best available science to make sure that we are addressing the disease in the most effective way possible. We also will continue to work hand in hand with landowners, hunters, and other deer enthusiasts as they are a critical piece of the fight against CWD. Additionally, we do recognize that we must balance the needs and wants of our constituents with the needs of the resource and disease management goals. While given current knowledge, it might be unlikely to entirely eliminate CWD from the landscape, there is a lot of strong evidence that with action, we can minimize the negative impacts over time and learn to live with this disease. MDC additionally continues to look for new ways to address the threat of disease and collaborate on CWD research. So there is some hope in the future that we will have new and better tools to address CWD spread in Missouri. We invite you to share your opinions and thoughts on CWD and especially the potential regulation changes we are considering. You can do this by visiting mdc.mo.gov/CWD. You'll find instructions about giving your comments. Thank you so much for listening and for being concerned about the health of Missouri's deer herd.